parish started actually running out of money, and they actually had to at times borrow money to pay the sisters who were the new teacher after Mr. Schaefer resigned. Since Schaefer resigned, the house that they provided him wasn't no longer in use, so they sold that house, and actually most of that money went to pay debt. They were in dire straits there for a while. They were able to buy more land, which is now the parking lot on the northern side. I'm sorry, they bought the land, which is now the parking lot behind the parish hall, and the playground, and actually part of the Little League field. So they extended their parish, their footprint a bit. Well, things got a little better with the Depression easing, and in 1902 they had a vote on what they should build next. The priest house that they had built prior across the street was aging, but also that school that they built in the 1860s was aging, so they had a vote on what they should do. They didn't have enough money for both, but they were going to vote on either a new school or a new priest house. Building committee is formed of the 32 men at the parish that showed up. They voted. They made a 4-man committee to do this. They voted to build a new school. So they have a subscription drive, kind of a fundraiser drive to raise money for it. But there's one catch. I said that they voted to build a new school. Well, in 1905, they built a priest house instead. There were other factors involved. There was some pressure from the bishop that the priests just did not have adequate housing. So that is probably the biggest factor for it. But this is a picture taken from just down the road, probably in front of where the current parish hall sits. And you can see the priest house there. It looks very similar today. You have St. Boniface Church, and you can see that steeple looks a bit different than what we know it as today. That's that spire, that tall steeple there. On the right-hand side, you have the school, and then you have, in the background actually, you have the convent. The last debt was paid for that priest house in 1911. It took them a little bit to pay it off, but they did. Now, one thing I thought I had in here, but I haven't seen it yet, was in the course of their debts, there was actually a settlement with the county courts. And they actually they were forced to pay an individual, and I'm probably going to butcher the last name, so maybe Teresa or someone from the museum can help me, but the person that they had to pay was a R.W. Shawn. Did I say that last name correctly? Yes? Now that might not be familiar with everyone here, but maybe not this portion of the building, but the museum itself was actually that gentleman's house. Is that correct, Teresa?
Correct.
He was the first millionaire in Tiffin, I believe. He was a number of different businesses, but at this point he did some kind of construction or some kind of material was purchased from him, and they had a judgment against them, and they actually had to pay that man. Here's another picture from a different view. You have the priest house, the church. It's a much better look at the front of the church. You can see actually on the sides there, the walls, how the roof comes down, and there are actually more spires there on top of it. Those would be removed later, but it looks both very similar and very different at the same time. This was from a postcard that I had found. So here in the 1910s, things started to look a lot better. The economic environment got better. They purchased a pipe organ, which is still used today at times. In 1908, they purchased that. An individual became the teacher and organist again, and he remained there from 1910 to 1947. Now, there were, in that time span that Mr. Schaefer left and Mr. Harlett came in, there were 4 different teachers, and a number of times the sisters had to fill in. So there's a lot of, it was kind of a revolving door there, but this added some stability for the parish. All this time, the Diocese of Toledo wasn't formed. It was still the Diocese of Cleveland. So the Diocese of Toledo was formed in 1911. In 1912, the orphanage closed. Remember, we had that wash house in the orphanage for girls. Well, that was closed, and they got a new priest who, since there was no debt, he restored the interior. They added a room. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. They added a room to the aged schoolhouse, which was in front of the church in some of the other pictures. So here's a picture of how it would look in 1913. Just a grand picture. It looks, again, so similar and so different. You can see, what stands out to me is those big white altars, both on the sides and in the center sacristy. Just huge figures in the room. You also have that white communion rail coming across the bottom, separating the sacristy from all the pews in the congregation. On the right-hand side, you'll see underneath the big wooden cross, it is a wooden confessional. It wasn't built into the building. The pews kind of made a spot for it, and it would have been wooden confessional there. Around the Stations of the Cross, which were original, they added this wooden framing around each station. It's hard to see in this picture, but all the way to the left, there's kind of a weird blob shape that's kind of blocking the white altar. Now, that would have been a kind of a stand for the priest to be at when he gave his sermon. And behind him would have been a large, kind of a dome that would have projected his voice outwards to the congregation. Now, that whole contraption is actually on rails. So when it came that time of the Mass, the servers would have had to push that out into the center, almost to the center of the aisle. He would have gotten up there, and then he would have gave his sermon. And at the end, they would have pushed it all the way back. You can see the pictures there, the murals, both in the center, which is cut off in this picture, and then the two on the walls there. And I just want to point out at this point we have the Mary and baby Jesus on the left in that white altar, and you have Joseph on the right-hand side inside that white altar. Here's another picture of it, just from the other side. Nothing, I shouldn't say nothing, but it doesn't seem to change a lot. This is from 1914. This picture was given to me from the late Josie Kimmett. She was always so fascinating to talk New Riegel history, St. Boniface history with. And one day when I was talking with her, she wouldn't let me leave without it. And I just adore this picture. It's really something to see. Well, also in that same time period, they had an expansion of the cemetery. They outgrew their portion from the original spot to where the Mother of God Chapel was built in the front. They started working their way towards the road. Nowadays, a lot of times, you purchase your plot and you can plan where you want to be. In these days, you didn't do that. They almost went in order. So they just started in one row, and as it needed, it got filled in left to right, and then they started over again. So a lot of times, if you're walking in an older part of a cemetery, you won't see husband and wife buried together. You'll see, the husband there, and a lot of times no mention of the wife. And then you'll see the wife later on, and it'll say wife of so-and-so. Sometimes her name is not on the stone. So if they're buried together and you see their names on the stones, a lot of times they made the area big enough for when the husband, who usually passed away first, was buried. The wife was buried next to them at a later date, and then a new stone was purchased. That way they could both be on the stone. But this here is a great example of 1913 and even earlier into the 1880s of the Egyptian revival period for cemeteries. You see a lot of tall obelisks, somewhere there in the 1880s, America became fascinated with Egypt, and we saw that a lot in our cemeteries. Now, on top of it, we have a capstone or a cross. That is not an Egyptian symbol. That would have been added on because of the Catholic belief. But it's just an amazing picture there. Here's another one that I found on a postcard. Now, this only focuses on the old portion of the cemetery. So if you're looking at it in current day, The old portion seems to be separated in two different sections, and there's a path right down the middle that never made much sense to me until I saw this postcard. You can see that there is the path right there in the middle, huge crucifix. So that would have been the only cemetery that they knew at that time. So that's why there is that path. It's still there today, and I've been told that they will never bury anyone to fill this in because they just don't know exactly where people are interned or aren't, and they don't want to disturb anything. You can see kind of in the center left, there's some stones, there's some areas that just have a wooden cross. Well, a lot of places today, there would appear that there's no stone, but I've always wondered, there has to be someone interned there, and just the headstone is lost to time. Then all the way to the left, the headstone, if you can read it, it's kind of small. You see Gase. That's another name that keeps popping up in the history. 1916, continued effort for that beautification. You have this wonderful cross. This picture I took just a few days ago. It's on the middle section of the cemetery. As I said, there's 3 sections now. It was put there in 1916. It was donated by the late Conrad Deitch, maybe. It's quite a towering presence. It would have been bequested from his estate after he passed. And I remember seeing his stone in the old section, but I can't remember where it is or how far away it is from this. But what a wonderful gift that he gave to the community there. Now that's not the only thing that stands out in the cemetery. As I said, there's a period of just like clothes and hairstyle, there's fashions that go in and out. And cemeteries are no different than that in that regard. But there's one that really stands out to me, and that is this memorial for Father Becker and his parents. Now, Father Becker is not in the history of St. Boniface as a priest. He was actually over in the Cleveland area. But his dad at one point was a school teacher for St. Boniface. And when the wife passed away, she was interned here at St. Boniface Cemetery. So when Anton passed away, he was laid to rest next to her at a later date. So Father Becker then put this tall monument here in honor of them. And when he passed away, he's laid next to them, and you have almost a coffin-looking headstone there. It's very unique. It's the only one of its kind in the cemetery. I've always kind of wondered what it was, and so when I found this story, okay, well, that makes more sense. I always thought it was interesting that a priest was buried here, but didn't seem to have a connection to the church itself. But it comes back to the community. So that brings us to 1919. Now, we have the brick schoolhouse that was built in the 1860s, 1862. It was voted to be replaced in 1902 and wasn't. Well, it was overcrowded, needed major repairs. And they just couldn't afford it at that time. So they added on a brick addition onto the back. So this the picture on the bottom right would be standing on the north side of the church, so you can see the school and the church is in the background. It was okay, but it just wasn't enough. It served its purpose for a while. They knew they needed something, but then in 1924, there was a minor fire that happened in the building. A furnace had a malfunction. It didn't do a lot of damage. Actually, one of the letters from the priest at the time said, the only downfall of the worst thing about this fire is that it didn't do enough damage. Because the building needed to be repaired so badly that this just forced their hand anyways. If the furnace wasn't working, the building needed to go. So they built the school. And this is the parish hall that most of us remember. It looks a little different today, but we will get there. It was completed in 1927. It's very symmetrical in its design. The doorway, this columned archway in the center, which we'll see a lot in pictures. I have a book up front that we can look at after the presentation. There's a lot of school pictures, a lot of class pictures taken on those